ring was still warm on her finger when the ship landed in the backyard. Not a crash. Not a distress signal. A landing. Full thrusters, navigation lights blinking in a color that had no name in English. The grass scorching in a perfect circle around it. Dan Cole stood on the back porch in his boxers holding a mug of coffee that had stopped being hot 30 minutes ago, and he watched the ship settle like it belonged there. His fiancée, Lena, Zas, was standing next to him in her oversized college sweatshirt. She had not said anything for 3 minutes. "You told me your family would visit," he said. "I told you they might," she said. "You told me you had sisters." "I do." "You did not tell me about the ship." Lena pulled the sleeves of her sweatshirt over her hands, which was the thing she did when she was searching for words. Dan had learned that in 14 months. He had learned a lot of things. Because he had learned that she sneezed 3 times in a row every single morning. That she could not watch movies where dogs were in danger. That she ate her cereal dry because she did not trust milk that came in cartons. He had learned that she was different in ways that went past personality, past upbringing, past any country or culture he could point to on a map. He had asked her about it exactly once. On a Tuesday in October, or sitting in the parking lot of a grocery store after she had done something with her hands that no human wrist could do. She had looked at him for a long time. Then she had said very carefully that she was not exactly from here. He had said, "Okay." She had said, "You are not going to ask more than that." He had said, "I figure you will tell me when you are ready." She had been ready on a Wednesday in February, over pasta. With a glass of water she was holding in that particular way. That was slightly wrong. She had told him about the coalition, about the 12 systems, about the survey program that placed observers on developing worlds, about how she had been assigned to Earth for what was supposed to be 3 years and had now been here for 9 and had no desire to leave. He had said, "Is that why you eat cereal dry?" She had laughed so hard she knocked over the water glass. He had asked her to marry him 6 weeks after that. Now there was a ship in the backyard. The hatch opened with a sound like a held breath being let out, and 5 figures stepped onto the scorched grass. They were tall, taller than Lena, who was already 3 inches above average. They wore clothes that were close to normal, close enough that a stranger might not look twice. But they moved with a coordination that was slightly too fluid, like they had all practiced being people and were very good at it. The one in front had Lena's exact jaw. She looked at Dan the way a person looks at a math problem they are confident they can solve. "You are the male," she said. "Dan," he said. "Dan Cole." "He gives his name first," the second one said to the third one. "It is a dominant signal," the third one said. "It is a greeting," Lena said, stepping off the porch in bare feet. "You are all terrible." The one with Lena's jaw smiled. It was almost the same smile. "We wanted to meet him before the ceremony. You could have called." "We did call. You ignored 11 messages." "I was busy." "You were hiding us from him." Lena stopped 2 feet from her sisters. She crossed her arms. Dan recognized the posture. It was the posture she used when she was losing an argument she did not want to admit she was losing. "I was not hiding you," she said. "I was preparing him." All 5 sisters looked at Dan. Dan took a sip of cold coffee. "I am prepared," he said. None of them looked convinced. The one with Lena's jaw stepped forward and extended both hands, palms up, fingers spread. It was clearly a formal gesture. Dan shifted the coffee mug to his left hand and placed his right palm on top of hers. She turned his hand over once, then released it and nodded once, sharply. "Acceptable," she said. Faye, Lena said, which was apparently a name. Do not evaluate my fiancé like he is a field specimen. I evaluated him for 11 seconds, Faye said. That is a courtesy. I evaluated the last candidate for 40 minutes. There was a last candidate? Dan said. No, Lena said. A brief one, Faye said. Faye. He left on his own. Faye. Faye stopped talking but did not look sorry about any of it. The other 4 sisters were spreading out across the backyard with the calm efficiency of people who had already decided where everything was going. One of them was examining the garden shed. One was measuring the fence with her hands. The smallest one, who looked roughly 17 in human terms and had Lena's same tendency to tuck her hair behind one ear, was crouched at the edge of the scorch circle, running her fingers through the grass. What are they doing? Dan asked. Assessing, Lena said. Assessing what? Lena was quiet for exactly long enough that the answer became obvious. The house, he said. We have good square footage, she said. Lena. The basement is mostly storage. The second guest room has not been used since your college friend visited 2 years ago. You said yourself that the side yard was wasted space. Dan set down his coffee mug on the porch railing. He looked at his backyard. At the ship, Jons, which was now humming softly in a frequency he felt more than heard. At 5 alien women measuring his property with varying degrees of subtlety. At his fiancée, who was watching him with that particular stillness she had when she was genuinely uncertain of the outcome. He had said yes. He had meant it. He picked up his coffee mug. The guest room, he said, needs new curtains. Lena exhaled. And whoever took the shed gets to clean it first, he added. The smallest sister looked up from the scorched circle. I will clean it, she said immediately. That is Ori, Lena said. She claims things before anyone else can. Smart, Dan said. Ori grinned. It was so much like Lena's grin that it did something to his chest that he chose not to examine in the middle of the backyard. Faye was still watching him with that flat, analytical stare. You are not alarmed, she said. It was not quite a question. I am a little alarmed, he said honestly. But you are not leaving. No. Why? Dan looked at Lena. She was looking back at him with the expression she wore when she was trying very hard not to show that something mattered to her, which meant it mattered enormously. Because I said yes, he said. I knew what I was saying yes to. Faye considered that for a moment. Then she looked at Lena. I understand now, she said, why you stayed. Lena said nothing. The ship hummed in its new frequency. Ori was already pulling things out of the shed. The thing nobody tells you about living with aliens is that the problems are almost never the ones you expect. Dan had made a list the night before Faye and her sisters arrived with their bags, which turned out to be not bags, but containers that folded into dimensions that luggage had no business accessing. His list included things like communication barriers, cultural misunderstandings, impossible accidental exposure of classified information, and what to do if the neighbors noticed the ship. He had not listed the bathroom schedule. There were 7 people now in a house with 2 full bathrooms and 1 half bath. 5 of those 7 people had a morning routine that was longer, stranger, and more architecturally ambitious than anything Dan had encountered in 31 years of being alive. Faye stood in the shower for exactly 4 minutes every morning, which was efficient. But she required the water at a temperature that fogged up the entire second floor. Ori needed 40 minutes minimum, but claimed she was almost done every time someone knocked. The middle sister, whose name Dan was still learning to pronounce correctly, used the half bath exclusively for something she called calibration, which she declined to explain and which made a sound like a tuning fork being struck underwater. Lena had warned him about none of this. You said it would be an adjustment, he told her on morning 3, standing in the hallway with wet hair and a towel because all 4 working showers were occupied. It is an adjustment, she said. She had somehow already showered. She was in clean clothes. She had coffee. How are you already done? I woke up at 5. Lena, you can share the downstairs bathroom with me. We make a good team. We do make a good team, he agreed, because they did. And because he was constitutionally incapable of staying irritated at her for more than 90 seconds. It was a personal failing he had made peace with. The harder adjustment was the kitchen. Dan was a decent cook, not a great one. He had a solid rotation of maybe 12 meals, and he executed them reliably. He had expected, when 5 additional people moved in, that the kitchen would become chaotic in the normal ways. Too many cooks, conflicting schedules, someone using the last of the olive oil and not writing it on the list. What he had not expected was that all 5 sisters were extraordinary cooks. Not in a trained way, in a way that suggested they approached cooking the way an engineer approaches a problem, which was to say they understood it at a level that made everything they touched unreasonably good. Vey made something on the 4th day that used only ingredients from his cabinet and smelled like a restaurant he could not afford. Ori made breakfast food that was technically just eggs and toast, but arranged and seasoned in a way that made him feel like he was tasting eggs for the first time. The sister whose name he was still practicing, K something, made a soup from scratch in 20 minutes that his mother would have asked for the recipe to, and then been confused by. Because there was no recipe, only instinct and precision. You are all doing this on purpose, he said on day 5, sitting at the dinner table that now had 7 chairs squeezed around it. Doing what? Vey said. Being useful. So I do not regret agreeing to this. The table went quiet in a way that felt communicative. Lena told us what you are like, Ori said finally. She was sitting next to Dan because she had decided on day 1 that they were friends, with a certainty that left no room for negotiation. What am I like? He said. You make decisions with your whole self, Ori said. You do not decide a small amount and then wait to see what happens. Lena said you proposed to her the same way. Dan looked at Lena. Lena was very interested in her soup. I asked her 3 times, he said. She said no the first 2 times. Lena looked up. I said not yet. Twice. I was being careful. You said not yet, and then 2 weeks later you called me at 11 at night to say you had changed your mind. I had gathered sufficient data. She called me at 11 at night, he told Ori. Ori nodded seriously. Lena makes decisions slowly and then executes them with great confidence. That is an accurate description of how she accepted my proposal, Dan said. Vey looked between them. And yet you were not bothered by the delay. No. Why? Dan picked up his spoon. Because when Lena makes up her mind about something, it stays made up. I figured the wait was worth it. Vey absorbed this. Her expression did the thing it did when she was recalibrating something. I see, she said. Outside, the ship sat in the backyard, and the neighbors still had not asked. Dan had been ready for the neighbors. He had a story about a sculpture installation, a backup story about a filming permit, and a third story about a very experimental greenhouse. None of them had been needed. The 2 neighbors to the left had looked at the ship once from their kitchen window and returned to their morning, and the neighbor to the right, old Mr. Pedro Garza, had walked to the fence on day 2, looked at the ship for a long moment, looked at the 5 tall women moving in and out of the house, looked at Dan and said, "That your fiancé's family?" Dan had said yes. Pedro had nodded and gone back inside. At night, when the house settled into its new noise pattern, Dan lay awake doing the thing he did, which was think through the shape of his life and check whether it still fit. This was not anxiety. It was a habit. He had done it since he was a kid. His life before Lena had a shape that was comfortable and mostly empty of surprise. His life after Lena had a shape he could not have drawn a map of before she arrived in it. His life now had a ship in the backyard and 5 alien sisters and a soup that had changed his understanding of what soup could be. And when he ran the check, when he held up the shape and examined it from every angle, the answer came back the same as it did every time he asked it. This fit. Not because it was easy, because it was real. Lena rolled over next to him in the dark and said, without opening her eyes, "You are thinking loudly." "Sorry. What are you checking?" "Everything." She was quiet for a moment. "And?" "Still good," he said. She made a small sound that was not quite a word and pulled the blanket up. 30 seconds later, she was asleep. Dan was not surprised. She had been doing recon for 9 years. She had earned the sleep. He looked at the ceiling and listened to the house. Footsteps upstairs. The faint underwater tuning fork sound from the half-bath. Ori's voice somewhere, talking to herself or possibly to the ship. He closed his eyes. Still good. The coalition sent a representative on a Tuesday, which Dan thought was very bureaucratic of them. He was eating lunch alone when the notification came through on Lena's secondary tablet, the one she kept on the kitchen counter that he had learned not to touch because it occasionally showed things in languages that moved. The notification was a sound more than a text. A low tone that brought Lena out of the study, Vey down from the 2nd floor, and the other 4 sisters in from wherever they had been in less than 45 seconds. The speed of their response told him this was not routine. "What is it?" he said. Lena picked up the tablet. Her face did the thing it did when she was translating in real time, a very slight stillness around the eyes. "The Coalition Oversight Board," she said. "They are requesting a formal visit." "To do what?" Vey said. She was already standing with her arms crossed, which was her ready position. "To assess the household integration." "They want to check if it is working," Ori said. "They want to determine," Lena said carefully, "whether the situation represents a violation of the observation protocols." Dan set down his sandwich. "Do I need to do something?" Lena looked at him. "You do not have to do anything. But it would help if I did." A pause. "Yes." "Okay. What does a formal visit look like?" The sisters exchanged a look that had layers. Dan had gotten better at reading those looks over the past 3 weeks. This one had the particular texture of a group of people who had been preparing for a possibility and were now recalibrating how prepared they actually were. "An assessor will come," Vey said. "They will observe the household. They will evaluate whether the integration is stable and whether it poses any risk to the observation mission." "Risk meaning what?" "Risk meaning," Lena said, "whether a human knowing about the program, living with program participants, represents a security exposure. And if they decide it does." The room was very quiet. "They will recommend reassignment," Vey said. Dan understood what that meant. He did not ask for clarification because he did not need it, and because clarification would have made it a conversation that had an emotional center, he preferred not to hand to anyone in this room right now. "When do they arrive?" he said. 3 days, Lena said. Dan picked up his sandwich again. Okay, he said. Then we have 3 days to be a normal household. Ori made a small, compressed sound. We are not a normal household. We are a normal household that has some unusual features, Dan said. Yet the assessor is going to look at this house and look at all of you and look at me, and they are going to be looking for one thing. What thing? Vay said. Whether I am a problem. He bit into his sandwich. I am not a problem. The preparation that followed was, as far as Dan could tell, the most organized 3 days of his life, and he had once helped plan logistics for a city infrastructure project with 12 competing departments. Vay ran it like a field operation. Ori took notes. The sister, whose full name Dan had finally learned to say, Kale, handled what she called information structuring, which meant making sure every version of every story in the house was consistent. Dan was interviewed on the second day, sitting at the kitchen table with Kale on one side and Vay on the other, and he answered every question without notes because the answers were not things he had to remember. When did you first understand? Lena was not human. A Wednesday in February, over pasta. Did you disclose that information? No. Why? Because it was hers to disclose. How did you respond when she told you? I asked her if that was why she ate dry cereal. Vay looked at him. You asked that? It seemed relevant. You were not frightened. I was a little frightened. I was also eating pasta. What were you most concerned about after the disclosure? Dan thought about it. Whether it changed anything. And did it? No. The assessor arrived on a Thursday morning, in a vehicle that looked like a rental car and probably was not. She was tall in the same way Lena's sisters were tall, and she wore the same slightly too fluid ease of movement. But her stillness was different. It was professional stillness, assessment stillness. Dan recognized it because he had been in enough evaluation situations to know when someone was watching for cracks. She sat in the living room with a tablet Dan suspected was doing more than taking notes. She asked Lena questions. She asked Vay questions. She asked Ori questions, and Ori answered with great enthusiasm and no apparent filter, which made Lena look like she was counting to 10 internally. Then she looked at Dan. You are the household member without program affiliation, she said. I am Lena's fiancé, he said. You are aware of the scope of the observation program. The broad strokes. And you have not disclosed this information. To who would I disclose it? The assessor paused. That is an interesting way to answer. It is the honest way, Dan said. Lena's family moved in. We are figuring out how to share 2 bathrooms with 7 people, and whose turn it is to cook, and how loud Ori is allowed to be before 10 in the morning. Ori, from the corner of the room, said, I am allowed to be moderately loud. That is still under negotiation, Dan said. The assessor looked around the room, at Vay, standing by the window, at Kale, sitting with her hands folded, at the 2 sisters Dan was still getting to know, Mira and Sue, who were sitting together on the small sofa sharing something on a screen, at Ori, who had at some point acquired a throw pillow and was holding it like a shield, at Lena, who was looking at Dan, at Dan, who was looking back. The assessor made a note. You are not performing stability, she said. No, Dan said. This is just Tuesday. She closed the tablet. I will file a continuance recommendation, she said. The household integration appears sustainable. She left 40 minutes later. The rental car that was probably not a rental car pulled out of the driveway, and the 7 of them stood in the living room in the quiet it left behind. Ori put down the throw pillow. We did it. We did nothing unusual, Vey said. We behaved as we normally behave. Which was the point, Dan said. Lena crossed the room and stood in front of him and put both hands flat on his chest, which was her version of a hug when she was too relieved to coordinate more than that. Thank you, she said quietly. For what? I just told the truth. You told it well. Dan put his hands over hers. The bathroom schedule, he said. That is the real threat to household stability, not the coalition. Lena laughed. It was the laugh he had fallen for on a park bench 14 months ago, when she had said something dry about a pigeon and caught him completely off guard. Same laugh, 7 people, 2 bathrooms. Still the best yes he had ever said. 3 months after the assessor left, the ship in the backyard became a point of neighborhood interest when a small child from 4 houses down walked through the gate, which Ori had left open again, and climbed onto the landing strut. Dan found out about this because Ori came into the kitchen where he was having breakfast and said, in a very careful voice, "There is a situation outside." The child was 6, maybe 7, wearing rain boots despite it being dry, and had gotten about 4 feet up the strut before stopping because there were no more handholds. He was not scared. He looked like someone who had accomplished something and was waiting for acknowledgement. His name was Theo. They found out when his mother arrived through the still open gate 40 seconds later. Theo's mother, a woman named Claire who had the look of someone who had already had a very full morning, stopped when she saw the ship and looked at Dan, looked at the ship again. Dan was already walking toward the strut. "Hey, bud, you need a hand coming down?" Theo considered this. "Is this a spaceship?" "It is a ship," Dan said carefully. "Does it go to space?" Dan looked at Lena, who had followed him outside. Lena looked at Vey, who was standing at the back door with her arms folded. Vey looked at the sky, which was not an answer. "It travels," Dan said. Theo processed this with the seriousness of a child who was gathering data for later use. Then he let Dan lift him down from the strut and immediately ran to his mother, who was still looking at the ship with an expression that was moving through several stages. "Claire, right?" Dan said. "I am Dan. We have not formally met." "What is that?" Claire said. "It is my fiancé's family's transport," Dan said. "They are visiting long-term." Claire looked at Lena. Lena gave a small wave. "Where are they from?" Claire said. "It is complicated," Lena said. "Would you like coffee? We have a very good batch this morning." This was the strategy they had not planned and had not rehearsed. And it worked better than anything they could have rehearsed, because Claire came inside and had coffee and met Ori, who showed Theo how to make the tablet display patterns and colors that delighted him, and met Kale, who told Claire about the soup that Dan still thought about. And by the time Claire left, she had the address for a recipe that did not technically have one, but that Kale wrote down as an approximation. At the gate, Claire turned back. "Your family," she said to Lena. "Yes," Lena said. "They are unusual." "They are," Lena agreed. Claire nodded slowly. "The good kind," she said, and took Theo home. Ori shut the gate this time. Twice. She checked it twice. Dan stood in the backyard after they had all gone inside and looked at the ship, which was no longer the newest thing in his life and had not been for a while. The grass around the scorch circle had grown back in sideways, angled out from the center in a pattern that looked, from the right angle, like something flowering. Pedro Garza appeared at the fence. "That the family again," he said. "That was a neighbor kid," Dan said. "Climbed the strut." Pedro looked at the strut. Sturdy. Very. Pedro was quiet for a moment. My wife wants to know if they do dinners," he said. "The tall one made something last week that came over the fence, and she has not stopped talking about it." Dan looked at the house. Through the kitchen window he could see movement. The easy, organized chaos of 6 women who had, in the space of 3 months, taken up every available corner of his home and life with such thoroughness that the shape before seemed now like a house that had not been properly lived in. "I will ask," he said. Pedro nodded. "Appreciated." Dan went inside. Ori was teaching Theo's pattern to Kale on the tablet. Mira and Sue were doing something with the back pantry they had been doing for a week, and that Dan had decided not to investigate until it was finished. Vey was reading in the chair she had claimed on day 2. Lena was standing at the counter with coffee, watching him come through the back door. "Pedro wants to know if we do dinners," Dan said. Vey looked up. "Define dinners." "The neighbors want to eat your food." A pause. "How many neighbors?" Kyle said. "Start with Pedro and his wife. Probably expand from there." Vey considered this. She looked at Kyle, who looked at Mira, who said something to Sue. "Friday," Vey said. "Friday," Dan confirmed. Ori looked up from the tablet. "Can I make something?" "You can make something," Dan said. Ori went back to the tablet with the focused energy of someone who had just been given a mission. Lena crossed the kitchen and stood next to Dan and looked at the room. At her sisters, occupying his house in the way they occupied everything, with full and total commitment. "You're happy," she said. It was not quite a question. Dan thought about the bathroom schedule, about the containers that violated the geometry of luggage, about the scorch circle growing back sideways into something that looked like it was blooming, about Theo in his rain boots on the landing strut, like about Pedro at the fence. "Yeah," he said. Lena leaned her shoulder against his. The ship hummed through the kitchen floor. Friday was going to be a lot of food. Friday arrived with the ambition of an event that had been planned by people who did not understand the concept of scale. What had started as Pedro and his wife had, by Thursday afternoon, become Pedro and his wife, their daughter, and her husband. The family with twins from the Blue House, Claire and Theo, Umper and a retired woman named Gloria, who lived on the corner and had apparently been told about the food situation by Pedro while getting her mail and had simply assumed she was invited. Dan sat at the kitchen table on Thursday night, looking at the list and said, "This is 14 people." 15, Ori said, not looking up from whatever she was preparing in a bowl that was too large for a domestic kitchen. Gloria is bringing her sister. We do not have enough chairs. Kyle is building more. Dan looked toward the back room, where a sound that was not quite woodworking but was accomplishing woodworking results had been going on for 2 hours. Kyle is building chairs. She builds quickly, Ori said. And well, do not worry about chairs. Dan worried about chairs for a while longer and then decided that was not actually the problem. The food was not the problem either, because in 3 months he had stopped worrying about the food. The food was always extraordinary and always sufficient, produced from a kitchen that was now organized in a way he did not fully understand, but that functioned better than it ever had under his management alone. The problem, if there was one, was that 16 strangers were about to have dinner with 5 beings from a program that was not supposed to be known about. He went to find Lena. She was in the study, which had been repurposed in small ways over the months. There was a second desk now, There were items on the shelves that had not been there before, some of which Dan could name, and some of which he had stopped trying to name. It still felt like his room. It felt like a room that had more in it now. "The neighbors," he said. "I know," she said. "They are going to notice things." "People notice what they are ready to notice," Lena said. Claire noticed that Ori was unusual and decided she was the good kind of unusual. Pedro noticed that Vey cooked like she understood what food was for. What people do with that noticing depends on what they are looking for. And if one of them is looking for something specific, then we have a conversation, Lena said. Like we had with the assessor, like you had with me in a parking lot. Dan sat on the edge of the desk. "You remember that parking lot?" "I remember everything," she said. "I told you that." "You told me a lot of things," he said. "You are still telling me things." She looked at him. "Is that a complaint?" "It is an observation." She almost smiled. The almost smile was one of the specific ones he had learned, the one that was warmer than any of her actual smiles. The dinner on Friday started at 6 and ran past 10, which no one had planned for, but which felt inevitable in retrospect. Vey had made a main that required 3 separate stages of preparation and tasted like something from a restaurant on a planet nobody at the table could have named. Ori had made her thing, which turned out to be a dessert that was architecturally improbable and which Theo ate 3 portions of and then fell asleep on the small sofa in the living room. Kyle's chairs were, as promised, excellent. Pedro's wife, whose name was Ruth, sat next to Mira and had a conversation for 40 minutes that Dan only caught pieces of, and which seemed to cover an enormous range of subjects with great ease. Gloria's sister, whose name Dan forgot and relearned twice before settling on remembering it was something with an L, sat next to Vey and asked her where she had trained to cook, and Vey said simply, "It was part of my education," which was the most honest possible answer. Claire watched Ori and Theo with the expression of a parent watching someone good with children, which Ori was in the specific way that someone is good with children when they approach them without condescension, as full people with full opinions who simply lack context. Dan moved through the room, doing the things a host does, and stopped around 8:30 in the kitchen doorway and looked at the table. His table. 7 chairs he owned, and 4 Kyle had built. 16 people. 1 ship in the backyard, invisible from this angle. Food that had no name in the languages most of these people spoke. Laughter that mixed registers and the sound of Ruth and Mira still talking, still going, deep into something. Lena appeared at his elbow with 2 glasses of water. "You are doing the thing," she said. "What thing?" "The checking thing. Looking at the shape of it." He took the glass. "Does it bother you?" "No," she said. "I do that too, like I have done it since I was assigned here. I check whether the shape of my life still fits the life I want." "And does it?" She looked at the table, at her sisters, spread through the room, integrated in the casual way of people who had stopped performing and started existing. "It used to feel," she said quietly, "like I was observing something I could not be part of. That was the assignment. Observe, do not integrate, take notes. And now my sister built chairs for the neighbors." She paused. "Now Pedro's wife and Mira are going to exchange contact information before the night is over. Now Theo knows how to make the tablet do the pattern and will definitely show his class at school, and his teacher will have questions." Dan was quiet for a moment. "That last one might be a problem." "It might be," she agreed. It is also inevitable. Ori should not have shown him. Ori was never going to not show him. No, Lena said. She was not. They stood together in the doorway and listened to the room. Theo, waking up on the sofa, immediately asking Ori to do the pattern again. Ruth saying something that made Mira put her hand over her mouth, surprised into a laugh. Gloria's sister, the L name, saying something to Vey that made Vey set down her glass and turn and really look at her, and the look she gave when something genuinely surprised her, which was rare. What did she say to Vey? Dan said. She asked where Vey was from. Lena said. The real version of the question. And what did Vey say? She said she was from a long way away, and that she had not expected to like it here as much as she did. Dan looked at Vey, who had picked up her glass again, who was answering what was probably a follow-up question with the careful, measured honesty she applied to everything. That is true, he said. For all of us, Lena said. Outside, through the kitchen window, the ship caught the last of the evening light and held it in its hull in a color that still had no name in English. And the grass around the scorched circle continued to grow back in its sideways flowering pattern, and the neighborhood continued to be a neighborhood, strange and ordinary in equal measure. Dan put his arm around Lena. She leaned into it, which she had learned to do without adjusting her height. A small adaptation she had made so long ago he had stopped noticing it. He had said yes. She had called him at 11 at night to say she had made up her mind. 5 sisters had come with a ship and an assessment protocol and chairs built in an afternoon and a dessert that should not have been structurally possible. Pedro was going to ask about weekly dinners. Dan was almost certain. Ruth had the look of someone forming a plan. And Pedro is going to ask about weekly dinners, he said. I know, Lena said. Vey will say yes. Vey will negotiate a schedule. Kale might build a bigger table? Kale, Lena said, has already measured the dining room. Dan laughed. The ship hummed. The room talked. 16 people and one held breath of a life that had grown into something nobody had drawn a blueprint for. Built out of yes and dry cereal and cold coffee on a back porch and an open gate and a child in rain boots and food that tasted like being fed by someone who understood what you needed before you said it. Still good. More than good. The shape of it fit now in a way that shapes only do when they have been made rather than found, assembled out of the particular strange materials of whoever showed up and stayed. Ori was doing the pattern again. Theo was clapping. Ruth was telling Mira something that was making Mira's eyes go wide in a way that meant it was either wonderful or unprecedented, and from this angle Dan could not tell the difference. And he decided that was fine. He did not need to tell the difference. He just needed to be here. He was.